15 years ago, I was sitting in my global relations class in seminary. And one of the people in that class that always stood out to me, who always had such profound things to say, was a colleague, a peer of mine named Stephen. Stephen was only a couple of years older than what I was, but he seemed to have a maturity about him that was well beyond his years. Unlike me, where I was trying to maybe sow that last oat before I jumped and took the plunge into ordination, Stephen seemed to have just a way about him, an aura about him that said that he had seen things in the world that many of us who were sitting in that global relations class had not seen. Prior to coming to seminary, Stephen had worked in a Peace Corps-esque type agency. It was run in a collaboration between the Lutheran and the Anglican and the Methodist churches, and he had spent 2 years in Africa. And I think Zimbabwe, but I'm not particularly sure about that. And unfortunately, I've lost track of Stephen over the years. But in that agency, he worked with 7 other people in this office of Anglicans, Methodists, and Lutherans. And they did medical work, and they did legal work, and they did educational work for the people there in Africa. And many of the things that Stephen shared with us in the global relations class there in seminary stuck with me even these 15 years later. But there is one thing that I have never forgotten that Stephen shared with me about his time of working in Africa. He worked with 7 other people in this office. And for an entire year, for 365 days, not a single day went by that he and his colleagues were working in that agency, in that office in Africa, that one of his colleagues or himself had to attend a funeral for someone who had died of AIDS. The little village that Stephen worked in with his colleagues in this Methodist and Anglican and Lutheran agency office, someone that they knew personally died each and every day because of AIDS. This Tuesday is December 1st, and since 1988, December 1st has been World AIDS Day, a day for us to commemorate, to remember, to yet again commit ourselves to advocate for a time and for the people who are living with HIV and AIDS, and to remember those who we have lost. And today, in 2015, 70% of the continent of Africa is living with HIV or AIDS. This year, in 2015, by the time the calendar is over, 2.5 million people around the globe will have lost their life to HIV or AIDS. Here in the United States, 225,000 people will die this year from HIV or AIDS and AIDS-related causes and diseases. And this is just something that's happening halfway around the world in Africa. There are people in this congregation right now who have been affected, who have lost loved ones to AIDS, including your pastor. So last year, in 2015, the United Nations gathered in Geneva, Switzerland for a special conference on HIV and AIDS. And during that conference, the General Secretary of the United Nations stood before the world and said, "We need a cure. And if we don't have a cure, then we need hope." But what good is hope? It's actually pretty good. Hope is a powerful elixir that can fill up a spirit and allow someone to take a step into tomorrow when they thought they might not be able to do so on their own. Hope is one of those things that, if provided for a person, even at the smallest amount, can turn the darkest of nights into morning again. Hope is one of those things that can bring us out of the depths of our depression. You can go from being the most isolated, depressed, downtrodden individual, and given just a smidgen of hope, boom, just like that, your world can turn around. Don't believe me? Over the last 3 years, there have been 2 amazing studies done in completely different areas of the world with completely different groups that have shown the same results. The first was done in Ethiopia through the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and the economics department there at MIT. They went to Ethiopia to work with people who lived in abject poverty, poverty which most of us cannot even fathom. And they took 2 groups of people. And the first group of people, they showed an hour-long inspirational video. And the other group, they showed an hour-long comedy. The group that was shown the inspirational video and then given tools on how they can improve their economic situation started to save money, the little bit of money that they had, and started to spend the little bit of disposable income that they had on the education of their children. Their behavior started to modify almost immediately by showing them this inspirational video which gave them just an ounce of hope. And their behavior didn't change for 1 day or for a week or even a month. They continued to show the same behavioral modifications of progress and forward-leaning behavior for over a year and a half. The people who were shown the 1-hour comedy and then given the same economic advice changed their behavior not at all. Given just a smidge of hope, people living in abject poverty started to see a better tomorrow. Another group, which was completely different, a case study was done at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. 2 groups of incoming students were separated from each other, and they told that there would be a competition, and that the group that met the goal would win some sort of award. It was a competition of push-ups and sit-ups and a timed 1-mile run, very Naval Academy-ish. The first group was told just to do your very best, and they calculated and they tabulated all the push-ups and sit-ups and the average time that group ran the 1 mile. And then the second group was told just to do your best, and they tabulated all the push-ups and sit-ups and the time 1 mile run that they ran. And after each group was done tabulating and presenting how many push-ups and sit-ups and how fast they could run a mile, the first group was told the goal is just there. They told them that the goal that they had to beat was they were almost there. They just needed a few more push-ups, a few more sit-ups, just a slightly faster time. The second group was told that they had come nowhere close to the amount of sit-ups they needed to do, nowhere close to the amount of push-ups they needed to do, and the time that they needed to run was so much faster than what they needed. And they were told that they had 1 week to train and that they would be timed, and their push-ups and their sit-ups would be tabulated again. Almost to a person in the first group, which was told that they were almost there. Almost to a person. The incoming students at Annapolis made the goal of the sit-ups, made the goal of the push-ups, and improved their time in the mile. The group that told them that they were so far away that you couldn't even fathom to get there, almost to a person, did less push-ups, did less sit-ups, and ran a slower time in the mile. When they interviewed a student from the first group, he used words like, "I couldn't wait to be tested again. I knew that I could do better." When they interviewed students from the second group, they used phrases like, "Why even bother? What's the point?" One was filled with hope and anticipation. The other was filled with apathy and despair. And the scripture that Patrick read, Psalm 25, the beautiful poet of the book of Psalms, writes about waiting on the Lord. waiting with steadfastness and faith on the Lord. But the word there, wait, in Hebrew is the word kawash, Q-A-W-A-S-H, kawash. And it actually translates slightly better than to wait. It actually translates a little better as to hope, or to wait with hopefulness. And the type of waiting that the psalmist is talking about is not the type of waiting that we do while we're waiting for an oil change, or we're waiting for a meeting to begin. No, the type of waiting that the psalmist is talking about is the type of waiting that we might do while our loved one is having surgery and we're in the waiting room, hoping, praying that they come through it. It's the type of waiting that we might do when we're putting a bid down on a house for the very first time and we're waiting for our realtor to give us a call to see if our bid has been accepted. It's that waiting with hopefulness and expectation that something grand and beautiful will occur. And that's the hope that the psalmist is imploring us to live with and to live through and to make part of our lives. And it's that type of waiting which beckons us into the season of Advent. As I was getting on a plane to fly to Texas, which would eventually go underwater while I was there, I wasn't kidding about coming back to San Diego and drying out. As American Airlines was beckoning us to the gate, CNN broke news that Turkey had shot down a Russian plane. And I didn't know that when we landed in Texas, if the world would be at war. Forces bigger and more powerful than I seem to be at play in the world these days. Terrorism and the threat of war and famine and disease on a macro level seem to be circulating. And we just sort of get swept up in it, those of us who live just everyday lives. And on a personal level, there are people who are struggling with depression and loneliness, ailment and disease, looking for just a little bit of hope that can brighten a dark day. And this is the world that the Christ child is born into. This is the world in which God beckons us forward to say, wait with expectation and hopefulness. Tomorrow will be better. We'll get through this today. We'll get through this because you can lean on me. You can be, in my steadfast love, I grant you the gift of hope this Advent season, God says. And we look and we say, how can it be different? We've been fooled too many times. We've hoped too many times. Why would this be different? Because as Dr. Günter Grass, a German physician in Berlin, welcomed a patient into his office 8 years ago who had been diagnosed with leukemia. He decided that he was going to try a very experimental treatment program with a young man named Timothy Ray Brown. Timothy Ray Brown had been diagnosed with leukemia, and Dr. Grass had decided that he was going to try a very experimental stem cell treatment that had never been tried before to cure this man of his leukemia. But Brown was also living with HIV. And no one had ever tried stem cell treatment to treat HIV. And the treatment was grueling and excruciating and painful for Brown, and it took over 4 years and 3 different types of treatment. But today, in 2015, Timothy Ray Brown is the first and the only human being ever to walk the face of this planet to one day be diagnosed with HIV and today be cured. Not in remission, not under control, but free of the virus. That in 1988, when we first commemorated World AIDS Day, many of us who would go on to lose loved ones to this horrific disease could fathom that a day would come that AIDS was curable. At the UN conference that I mentioned earlier in the sermon, where the General Secretary of the UN said, if we don't have a cure, can we at least have hope? Dr. Gross and Timothy Ray Brown sat in a panel, and a doctor from Uganda begged them to come to Africa so that they could be a symbol of hope for those 70% of that continent living with HIV and AIDS. The creativity of hope, the power of hope to drive us to a better tomorrow, to overcome what once seemed impossible, is the world in which God beckons us into today. So where do you need hope? Where in your life do you feel hopeless? Where in the world do we need to send a prayer of hope? For as the Christian apologist and the poet G.K. Chesterton wrote, to love means to love the unlovable. To forgive means to forgive the unpardonable. To have faith means to believe the unbelievable. And to hope means to hope when all seems hopeless. There was a day when the idea of curing AIDS seemed like a hopeless thing to believe in. That day is gone. So what do we hope that we might be able to overcome today, personally and in our world? Because that is the gift that God grants us this day, on the first day of Advent. Happy New Year. Amen.